Hello and welcome to the first Never Mind the Bar Charts of 2025 with myself, Mark Pack. And it's lovely to welcome back to start the year Professor Paula Surridge from Bristol, who specialises in understanding how social and political values shape political behaviour. Welcome back to the show, Paula.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I took that description of your specialism from the university website, so I hope it reflects how you view yourself as well.
I probably view myself a little bit broader than that these days.
There,
But
to
it's
be
pretty
fair to
good.
your university, there is more about you on the website as well.
Yeah. I think it
But
probably hasn't been updated for a while.
So just before Christmas, though, you had a new article out for Political Quarterly looking at the extent to which the 2024 general election was a verdict on the then government's competence, a valence election, I think, in your political science jargon, rather than a big choice by voters between different ideologies. So what did you find?
So it's probably worth just revisiting that jargon for listeners briefly. And certainly after the election and even just before it, many people were calling it a valence election, one which is a judgment on competence, leadership, and delivery. And it comes from an idea that for some issues, what the outcome should be is broadly agreed. Everybody wants the same thing, and it comes down to who they think can deliver it best. And that's where the idea of competence and leadership comes in. So to give listeners some ideas, that will be things like controlling inflation, lower crime rates. Everybody kind of knows what they want the outcome to be, and it's who can deliver it. And that's usually compared with positional issues where people actually want different things. So, for example, rejoining the EU or levels of immigration would be positional issues. And we know that over the course of the last parliament, the Conservatives just lost their reputation for competence in pretty much every area. It took at the risk of getting a cease and desist letter, it took a particular hit after the Truss mini budget, but they'd lost trust on all sorts of other issues. It wasn't that was a big turning point, but it was certainly not certainly not the only one. And by the time of the election, there was just not a single issue where the public thought that the Conservatives was handling the issue well. Even when we look at things like the pandemic, that had dropped to about 50% of people that thought they'd handled it well. I think the possible only slight one that was slightly the other side of the 50% was Ukraine. So nothing was being handled well. Nobody liked the leadership. Ipsos asked, do you think this party should win the election? Do they deserve to win the next election? And 2/3 of voters said no, they didn't. So in that sense, we can say, well, this is a party that have lost all those positive valence things. They've all gone, and so it's no surprise whatsoever that that party lost 20 percentage points off its vote. And you could sort of stop your explanation of the election at that point. Job done. We know why the Conservatives lost. But what that doesn't tell us really is why those votes didn't just simply flow to the alternative government that they thought could deliver.
Mm.
And that's where I think the values come in. So, we know that Labour lost voters as well as gaining from some. Overall, they lost voters. Some of that is through tactical voting, which I'm sure we will come back to
Mm.
in the course of the conversation. But some of it wasn't tactical voting. Some of it was actually more ideologically driven. For example, those that switched between Labour and the Greens are really unlikely to say it was for tactical reasons. It's only about 3% who say that. Whereas the flow from the Lib Dems to and from Labour is much more likely to have been for tactical reasons, and about 30% of that group say so. So what I wanted to demonstrate that was while valence explained really well why the Conservatives lost votes, it didn't really help us understand where those voters went. It wasn't a valence decision based on delivery that led people to vote for reform, for example. It wasn't based on delivery that led people to led the Greens to win 4 seats, led to a handful of independents being elected as well. So that's what I really wanted to explore, was that there were value reasons underneath those flows that explained where voters went to, as well as the kind of obvious the Conservatives lost it kind of line.
And presumably those values are quite important in explaining where people went to reform. Because I think if you sort of say, well, if people are unhappy with the government, did they go to Labour or did they go to the Lib Dems? it feels intuitively, and I think there is, some evidence to back this up, that a large part of that is about the tactical vote situation in the constituency. And they went Labour in the constituency in Oxfordshire, where Labour was doing the most and the Lib Dems least, and they went Lib Dem in all the rest of Oxfordshire, where outside the city, which is a slightly different situation, but all the rest of Oxfordshire where the relative campaigning was reversed. But reform, I think, doesn't seem to have been driven by tactical considerations nearly as much. There's maybe a little bit of that in terms of where reform was very obviously targeting. And therefore, you have to get into values to some extent to explain why in some places people went reform and in others didn't.
Absolutely. You see with the reform switchers who mostly came from the Conservatives, not exclusively, but mostly, they're also quite unlikely to say it was for tactical reasons. I think it's less than 1 in 10 for that group. And what we see if we look at the values pattern is that the reform vote is really concentrated in the groups that we would think of as less liberal. So I mean, we could probably spend another whole podcast talking about how we should label that particular group of voters. Some people will call them socially conservative. The particular scale I use tends to call them authoritarian. But those that the ones that are away from the most liberal positions on issues is where the reform vote is concentrated. It's most concentrated for those who are also on the economic right, but there's also a significant vote that are economically left. It's in that not liberal part that they win voters the most.
And thinking about that sort of 2 by 2 grid, as it were, because you've got and I will pick, the liberal authoritarian scale, but as you said, there are others, but you've got the liberal authoritarian scale and you've got the left right on economy scale. That gives you, 4 different combinations of being, say, left on the economy, but socially authoritarian, or right on the economy, but authoritarian, and so on. I think quite often when people have talked about that pattern in the past, it's then led to discussions about, well, is there a particular gap somewhere, that a party isn't, that no party's filling? But also quite often, this party that, maybe did really well at the previous election might be in trouble because its support is actually, too spread across different parts of that quadrant. So taking the second of those first, looking at that 2024 result, I mean, the thing about any successful general election result is it almost always means you put together a relatively broad coalition of support, and therefore, by definition, it can look quite brittle if you say, well, how much commonality is there amongst the people who've just voted for this party that's done well? But that, granted that, do any of the parties' results in 2024 look particularly risky or fragile to you, above and beyond the simple, well, if you've won lots of seats and won lots of votes, there's bound to be a fair degree of variety?
So in terms of the kind of values coalitions, this is one of the slight ironies of the election, is because vote shares were generally lower, in some ways the coalitions look less fragile.
Oh, interesting.
Because actually the voters that you might have lost have already been lost. So in some senses, in pure values terms, the coalitions have perhaps looked less fragile than, for example, the Conservative coalition after 2019 looked incredibly fragile right from the get-go, because it had brought in people with quite left-leaning economic positions into this quite right-leaning party and coalition. So it always looked as if there were going to be fractures along those lines. Now, there are still fractures in the Labour vote and in the Lib Dem vote, which we can talk about in a bit more detail, in terms of having brought in people who are different for Labour, particularly along that liberal authoritarian axis. But again, I'd anticipated that coalition to be much more fragile after the election than in actual fact it is, because the voters they might have won right at the authoritarian end voted reform. So the ones that they might have stolen off the Conservatives at that end went to reform, and the voters that they weren't too concerned about losing at the Liberal end voted independent and Green. So in some sense, the fragility's already happened.
Yeah. And hence the fact that although the Labour vote for a government vote share in the polls is quite a low vote share, although Mrs. Thatcher was doing worse at this point and went on to win another two general elections and the Tories another one beyond that. So one shouldn't read too much into that. But although the Labour vote share is relatively low, if you look at how many percentage points it's down on their general election result, that it's not, it's not a massive number, is it? And so I guess what you're saying is they almost did the votes that you lose after polling day, they managed to lose them before polling day, and
Yes,
which suggests
absolutely.
maybe that there is we should put a bit more weight on that point, that being where they are at the moment in the polls may not be as bad for them as it looks at first.
Yeah, so I've written about that a couple of times in blogs and other pieces. Firstly, there's this point that the fragility has already been taken into account at one level, and then the other thing is the current voting polls, VI polls, they're losing the tactical voters. So the people that came in from the Greens and from the Lib Dems in various places around the country as tactical votes probably aren't giving a tactical response to a vote intention poll when they know there's no election coming up. They won't have even thought about the tactical situation.
And
So we
this
would
is a big
expect,
issue with Lib Dem support
yeah,
particularly in things like constituency polls or MRP models in between elections as well, isn't
yeah,
it?
yeah, absolutely. So we would have expected, that Labour share to be down a little bit the day after polling almost. Although I think, it's hard to say exactly what point you stop getting from people how they voted when you ask them a vote intention poll and start getting how they would vote, because obviously there's an element of people just saying how they actually voted at the start. But I think people have been, very concerned if they're Labour strategists, excited if they're not about the Labour vote share. But I think it's solider than it looks
Mm.
because of those two factors, and because we know that some voters are kind of amenable to being squeezed back to Labour if a tactical situation in their constituency were to change. So if they were faced with the very real prospect of a Reform MP, for example, that would change the sort of calculus for a lot of people.
And the other thing, which I think will be extremely hard to know, although there will be some clues from evidence, but will be extremely hard to know probably until 10 p.m., next general election polling day, is the extent to which first past the post copes or doesn't cope with a situation where it's quite possible that the winning party at the next election is on under 30%, and that there are, two, three, whatever parties, four parties, maybe even, in the 20s in total, that feels like the sort of vote pattern that first past the post just is not designed at all to cope with. And also the sort of vote pattern that national voting intention polls are a really poor basis from which to then try to extrapolate seat number projections. So we may be plunged into the equivalent of what those who like to ban opinion polls always, call for. We may be plunged into that world of darkness simply because the data isn't there to be able to tell us.
I think that's absolutely the case. We really just don't know how the electoral system would cope. And what we might actually see are lots of
Yeah.
sort of mini electoral systems
Yeah.
happening in different regions that actually cope quite well. So we'll have to really wait and see. There's so many moving parts between now and then.
So if there is, as it were, more hope for Labour in their current standing than it might appear at first glance, for the reasons you've just said around, as it were, their preemptive shedding of votes pre-polling day. What about thinking about it from the point of view of voters and whether there's a gap in that quadrant of those two different axes where there isn't a party really filling? So it's a point that's been made for quite often in the past, is this argument that there was a gap for a socially conservative stroke authoritarian but sort of left on economics party. And arguably, I think there's probably quite a good argument, isn't there, that was sort of the gap that Boris Johnson filled in 2019,
Yeah,
because he was
definitely.
very much pro-Brexit, but he was wanting to spend billions and billions of pounds on public services. He wasn't doing a Liz Truss and wanting to abolish, huge swathes of tax income. It was get Brexit, but get almost a Gordon Brown type message in terms of the number of extra police and hospitals and all the stuff we can argue. And the day we're recording, it's in the news again, an argument about whether those hospitals were properly funded, plans were properly funded, and all that. But in terms of the message, it was very much, there were weirdly, there were big chunks of what Boris Johnson said in 2019 that could have been said by Gordon Brown, in years previously. So Boris Johnson seemed to fit that gap. The Reform Party seems to have an ongoing internal debate, tension as to what extent it is that, boost public services versus the more traditional small state right-wing outlook. But from the point of view of the voters, do you think there is a gap there or anywhere else in that quadrant?
So I find that group of voters just endlessly fascinating because they're what political scientists sometimes call cross-pressured voters. So they are leaning left on economics and leaning away from the left or towards the authoritarian end on social issues. And there has been, there isn't a party that does that in our system, but that's true of lots of other Western democracies as well. So this is a group of voters that quite often find themselves in that position. Now, I've been trying to get to grips with this a little bit since the election, and the British election study team since the election have started talking about voting blocks around Leave and Remain, or you could of course do this versus sort of left and right. And I have taken a look at this in terms of values groups, and you do see for that left authoritarian, left socially conservative, whatever we'd call them, group, they have the highest level of switching between a left and right block in either direction between 2019 and 2024. So they have a much higher likelihood of switching. Conversely, those in the liberal left block are the least likely to have switched blocks. They've been in a left-wing block and they stay there. We also find that amongst that group, that left authoritarian group, they split between, if they stay in a consistent block, they're split between whether that's consistently right or consistently left. So they're a block of voters that aren't firmly behind one set of parties and are very likely to switch around. And I think that is because there's no party that fits them neatly. So depending on what they're prioritizing at any particular time, that's the way they vote. And Labour were able to make some small gains there this time because they were more concerned about the cost of living and economic issues than they were about immigration and Brexit. And I think you're absolutely right that Johnson got the appeal to those voters completely right in 2019. But they were also a group of voters that were really quick to turn away from the Conservatives after Partygate. They didn't wait for the trust budget. They'd turned against the Conservatives long before that happened. So it's a group, because they are not naturally conservative in the same way that they're not naturally Labour, they're not connected to a party. So they become more volatile. They're more likely to move away from them. I think it is a group that Reform have clearly been trying to target, but they get the messaging wrong on economics more times than they get it right for that group. So the messaging that they use on welfare does work quite well with that group. Although they're economically left-wing, it's kind of economics in terms of anti-big business and pro-state ownership rather than pro-welfare. And as soon as Reform start talking about employment rights, other aspects, even net zero, they're starting to get out of line with that group. And then, their biggest weakness is on the NHS.
Yeah. And in a way, this group is partly a group that Tony Blair appealed to quite successfully. So having gone for the let's compare Boris Johnson to Gordon Brown, let's go for the comparing Nigel Farage to Tony Blair follow-up, which is, I think, that what New Labour did very sort of successfully for a significant period of time was, as you say, appeal to that group of people through talking about improved workers' rights, improved employment rights, but also having very sort of penny pinching language on welfare. So it was introduce the national minimum wage, but also talk about cutting welfare and actually cut, not just talk about it, but actually squeeze welfare benefits. And that combination, there's clearly an audience, for that, whatever we might think about the rights and wrongs of each element in that package. And it feels like that's what Reform is sometimes sort of copying, in a way, the Tony Blair playbook with that combination. And as you say, sometimes not. I guess to just really add to the complete the hat trick of unusual comments. I mean, I guess in fairness to Reform, that's probably because partly they are torn between principle and pragmatism, that actually, it's not so much they're being inconsistent, but they're being torn between what many of them personally believe and what they realise they need to do to win over those voters.
Yeah, and I think you could make an argument actually that Starmer's government is doing many of the things that would appeal to those voters. They're just making a real hash of presenting them as such. So, some of the things around employment rights that have been introduced would appeal to those voters. Some of these things around windfall taxes and so on appeal to those voters. Funding the NHS, having a publicly owned energy company, all those things appeal to those voters. So I don't think Labour are necessarily doing the wrong things. They're just not necessarily selling it in the right way. But Reform's big weakness here is on the NHS, and they don't tend to equivocate on that. They're quite clear that they want to change the funding model for the NHS. And this group of voters and those that have voted Reform, they want public ownership of services. Even on rail and water, they're in favour of public ownership, and on the NHS, it's overwhelmingly in favour. So I think that's the kind of Achilles heel for Reform in terms of broadening their appeal beyond where they are currently.
So we very much zoomed in on one bit of that quadrant. Looking across that quadrant again from the voters' perspective, is there any bit of the quadrant that sort of strikes you as being underserved? Let's say the one that we've zoomed in on is the one that people have often highlighted in the past as saying there isn't really a political party pitching to it. But do you see any other gaps? Is there somewhere another party should be headed?
Well, not really, but there is a gap, but I wouldn't send a party there because there aren't actually very many voters there. So we've got a similar sort of set of cross-pressured voters around the liberal but right-wing economics group in terms of there isn't really a party serving that group of voters, but that group of voters is very small. So if you were to build a party strategy on trying to fill that gap, it wouldn't be successful. Whereas the group of voters in the left authoritarian cross-pressured voters is quite large. The exact estimate will vary on where you draw the boundaries, but anything between 20 and 25% of voters can be in that quadrant. So it's worth a party being there, whereas it's not worth a party trying to fill the other gap.
Okay, and I guess the other question in terms of what parties should be doing in response to this sort of data is to what extent will the next election be a valence election? So particularly from the point of view of Labour, but also parties opposing Labour, to what extent is the next election just really going to be about the performance of the government? And if they do well, they'll do well. And if they do badly, they'll do badly across the value space, as it were. And I'm thinking about the last sort of few general elections. It feels like we've been on a bit of a roller coaster in that sense that 2019, there were definitely big ideological differences, between Corbyn and Johnson over whether or not to go ahead with Brexit. 2017 feels like it sort of was much more, at least an election about a collapse in the perception of Tory competence during the campaign, because of Theresa May's stumbles. 2015 probably had rather more ideology about it, but it just feels like we've had quite a few different sorts of elections. So is it just that it varies hugely, or is there some either more consistent pattern or longer term trend about the relative importance of sort of valence and values, if I can boil it down to as trite a trio of words as that?
You'll have to wait till later this year when a colleague and I will be writing about why valence itself depends on values.
That feels like a very academic development in debates, doesn't it? Well, you both got these other two concepts, but no, actually no, they're really one is dependent on the other.
But maybe I can come back later in the year to talk about that. But this one, I mean, I think it was this podcast where I got very frustrated with you for trying to get me to say whether we were in 1992 or 1997. Quite possibly. I think there is a tendency for us to always try and read too much into each individual election. This election is going to be like those. And in some ways, it's a shame that there's a fantastic chart to illustrate the point I'm about to make, which I'll share with you, and then you can pass it on.
I'll stick a link in the show notes.
Stick a link in. And what it does is it looks at the share of the vote for parties outside of, I mean, we can call them outside the big two, or we can include the Lib Dems and call them outside the big three. It doesn't make much difference to the overall story. And you can see that was rising and rising, and then it kind of peaked in 2015. And then we all know the story of 2017, that completely collapsed. And, you know, I had a paper sat on my hard drive all about the fragmentation that in 2017, I just kind of virtually tore it up and started again, because we were back to a two-party system. And even in 2019, it rose a little bit. Then in 2024, it peaks again. And I think the real question going forward on, and I don't know the answer, but the real question is, to what extent 17 and 19 were Brexit blips in that kind of sequence, in some ways elections that we weren't supposed to have, certainly 2017, and whether 2024 has put us back on what was always our trajectory. I tend to think that's the case. And now I'm going to be completely proved wrong by 2029 being a two-party election, but I don't think that's where we're heading, because the divides in the electorate have been long-standing. The electorate haven't changed that much in terms of their beliefs and principles and what they want to see and so on. The parties have moved around quite a lot, but the voters haven't. And I think we've seen this, I call it unanchored sometimes, decoupling of voters and parties, which leads to what looks like quite a lot of volatility, but in some senses is just voters trying to find comfortable position, trying to find parties that they're comfortable with, when we're in a landscape where the parties have changed quite a lot as well. So, you know, over that period, you know, would you really expect somebody to vote for both Cameron's Conservatives and Johnson's Conservatives, or Corbyn's Labour and Starmer's Labour? Actually, the parties have been moving around a lot as well. So I think that in this world where people aren't anchored to parties, we are likely to see that share creeping up. So back to the question about the next election, and is it going to be a valence election? Is it all going to be about competence and so on? It's so hard to say at this point. I think that's the first thing. If we imagine where we were kind of just over 6 months after the last election, and anybody had made any predictions at that point, I don't think any of them would have come through. You know, who at that point would have predicted Sunak as leader of the Conservatives at the next election? So we've got a lot that could change, but the voters don't change quickly. And so I think we're going to keep that underlying fragmentation and willingness to give other parties a try. We know the Conservatives' reputation isn't recovering quickly. It certainly hasn't. You know, we haven't seen a new leadership bounce that looks as if that's recovering quickly. Reform, I don't think, are going to disappear, because they've got Senedd and Scottish Parliament elections coming up where they can work under PR, probably do quite well. I don't think they're going to collapse in the way that they did. And, you know, I don't think the Lib Dems are going to go away either. So I don't see any party kind of ripe for bouncing back or ripe for collapse, which leaves us in this, you know, possible nightmare world where we end up with 3 or 4 parties getting 20-something% of the vote and not quite being able to make a government out of it.
Yeah. And I mean, I think partly what you say reminds me of the thing I often say, and apologies, I will not apply this to your general election book that you're co-authoring when it comes out, but I always think the best way to read general election books is one election in arrears. Because, you know, reading about, say, the 2017 election after you know the outcome of 2019 puts a very different spin on things. And there's a whole load of stuff talked about the rise of social media in 2017, and where you just think, well, that clearly just, you know, that where did that all go between 2017 and 2019? You know, the sort of the left wing sort of online bubble, which seemed to be very effective for Labour in 2017, wasn't some fundamental remaking of how the media operates and so on, because it was followed by 2019. But I think it's still an open question, isn't it? Although we've had another election since 2019, whether 2017 or 2019 will turn out to have been the outlier. Because you can imagine if we have, you know, another couple of elections that maybe result in Labour governments being re-elected, maybe not with big majorities, but we have a period of Labour rule, it will very much look like 2019 was the outlier. You know, you had that decline in the Conservative Party over several years, over several leaders, interrupted by the one-off impact of Brexit being able to, you know, fuel a short-term election bounce for the Tories. On the other hand, if the Tories do come back, in some semi-miraculous way through this parliament and have an extremely good general election result, it may be that 2017 is looking much more the outlier, because 2017 might turn out to be the one election for a very long period of time, or the only one since Blair in which Labour, had a very popular leader who went down well with the public overall in the election. Ed Miliband wasn't a success in 2015. Gordon Brown obviously was very unpopular by the time of the 2010 election. Corbyn 2019 version was not popular. Keir Starmer 2024 version, certainly much more popular than Rishi Sunak, but against a prime minister with normal ratings, as it were, his ratings would have looked very underwhelming. So it's still an open question which of those two is the outlier.
Yeah, I agree with your comment as well. It's funny. I've literally just written a piece for a report coming out next week that concludes it's easier to understand an election, one election removed from it, because it was a piece about 2019. And for me, I think 2019, it was like a half story, and 2024 gives us the full picture. So 2019, we saw that fragmentation on the left or the Remain side, however you want to phrase that, but we didn't see it on the other side of the coin. And then in 2024, we get it on both sides, and we see where that happens. And so I think in some ways, I still see 2017 as the outlier, and think that 2019 was getting us halfway along the path to where we ended up.
And I guess the other question in all of this is, in as much as there are trends that we can divine, or possible alternative, pictures that we can draw that we're not sure which is going to turn out to be true, what do they mean for the Lib Dems? And, I guess that fundamentally one of my reasons for skepticism about some of the, confident predictions people make based on long-term trends is just the experience of seeing how, for a long period running up to the alliance, there was lots of stuff about how the two-party system in British politics was breaking down, and it got closest to breaking down in 1983, but didn't. And all of those long-term trends sort of ran into the immovable object of a two-party system, political system, and first past the post. And in the end, the long-term trends lost out. And so, for all of the caveats that I'm sure it's sensible to add to what you're about to say, do you think those issues around fragmentation and the like, point to there being a big political space for the Lib Dems in the years to come? Or is it more about politics may revert to a two-party nature, and the big Lib Dem challenge is how on earth to sort of somehow scurry into a corner and grab a little piece of that?
As I kind of already indicated, I don't see two-party politics coming back. And one of the things that's helped kind of holding back those tides is the fact that we've now got devolved parliaments elected under PR. So people are used to alternatives, which I think, and they're used to voting for a wider range of parties. And actually, if we look at an awful lot of constituencies over the last couple of elections, we've got lots of two-party competitions. It's just not always the same two parties. So in some senses, people are making a choice between two parties, but they're not necessarily doing it at the national level. And there's so much about the electoral workings of the electoral system. For the Lib Dems, I mean, I know that it's a very live, the kind of seats versus vote strategy is always a very live issue. And it makes complete sense in our electoral system to work with the seats strategy. It makes sense, and it certainly paid off in 2024. But it does then place a bit of a cap on the ambition, because there's not very many places beyond. It's much harder then to move beyond that set of seats. So that, I think, is an issue going forward. But that's a little bit out of my... That's much more about electoral geography, which isn't entirely my specialism. I've delved into the numbers in some depth for the Lib Dems since the election, and roughly equal parts of the votes that the Lib Dems gained came from Labour and the Conservatives. So it's not a one-way flow, and that makes strategy that bit more difficult. And there's a few more things that make strategy difficult. I'm afraid I haven't got a lot of comfort. I've just got a lot of challenges. The votes that came from Labour were largely tactical votes. So obviously the tactical situation needs to remain the same for those voters to stay. Those voters those that came from Labour were much more likely to be from that liberal left group. They were much younger on average than both those that came from the Conservatives and the existing Lib Dem vote, but as highly educated as a traditional Lib Dem voter, so 7 out of 10 with degrees. So I think that the challenge for holding on to that bit of the coalition, if you like, is about there still being those strong motivators to vote against the Conservatives. I don't think they're going away for that group, but also relies on the Lib Dems not at some point either being seen as anti-Labour or alienating those voters. And we know there are some issues that those voters care a lot about, and it is possible to alienate them in one way or another. So I think that's a challenge, but probably a relatively easy challenge because they're not voters who are going to reconnect with the Conservatives anytime soon. Whereas on the other side, the ones that came from the Conservatives, much more likely to say they did so because they thought the Lib Dems were the better party or the better candidate, much less likely to be a tactical vote. In some ways, looking more socially like a traditional Lib Dem voter, like you might think. So similar levels of home ownership, a little bit older, but not a lot older, certainly not young like the Labour voters were. And I suspect holding on to those is probably okay whilst the Conservative focus is all on reform and trying to win over reform voters. But if their focus switched back to trying to be seen as competent on the economy, for example, that would be more of a challenge. And again, I think it's one of those things that every party will say, well, what should we do? And the trouble is, for every party in this system with so many, it depends so much on what everybody else is doing. The Conservatives, had the Conservatives elected a different leader, not from their final two, but perhaps from their final three, then the problem looks slightly different. But I think with the current leadership and the real play to go after reform voters, I think that leaves that space there for the Lib Dems to hold on to those. It's more difficult, I think, to see how the Lib Dems can then grow further in terms of seats. And I think that is probably where it becomes much more difficult when you've done so well as to win all the seats you were targeting. Where can new targets come from is perhaps the more difficult question.
Well, I think the answer on that is the geography is surprisingly promising for quite a few more gains. So I will include in the show notes for listeners the pamphlet I wrote with Jim Williams just before Christmas that delves into that side of it. But to think about the values aspect with you, Paula, I guess one way of interpreting what you've just said is that the more closely values-based switchers were in a way from the Tories, or rather those with the more similar values to the Lib Dems were switchers from the Conservatives, and the more transitional, transactional switchers were those from Labour, which feels to me like the better way around for it to be, given we now have a Labour government, in that whilst the transactional nature of that Labour support may be harder to secure if there isn't a Tory government to tilt against with a tactical voting plea, on the other hand, the tactical situation in the seat is unequivocally that the Lib Dems are best placed to win, because in the seats we're talking about, the Lib Dems won or came second. And secondly, the government is likely to be less popular with voters at the next election than it was at the last. That's just the natural way of things in politics. And so those Labour voters are likely to be put off a bit by what the Labour government does as well. And hence there are extra reasons to think we can hold on to that support, whilst the people being really unhappy with the Tory record in government, being unhappy with the Prime Minister, kick them out. Tories are no longer in government. There's no longer a government track record to directly hold against them. And a new Tory leader, that those might be the ones who are harder to hold on to. But if they're the ones who are more similar to what Lib Dems believe, then actually they might be maybe easier to hold on to. I think the other thing that really struck me was, apologies to John Curtis's co-author, whose name escapes me, but John Curtis and some other distinguished person did a piece about the level of anti-Tory tactical voting in the 2005 election that I read recently, and I was quite struck by their conclusion about how little anti-Tory tactical voting had faded in 2001 or 2005. So I think there's also the just because the Tories are out of power doesn't mean that tactical voting fades. But all of that, it feels to me like, although you started your comments with saying that, they weren't going to be very good news for the Lib Dems, I feel quite upbeat at the end of that. What have I, in a Panglossian way, glided over, and where have I turned bad news wrongly into good news in interpreting your your view of the data?
I don't think it's a question of turning bad news into good news. I haven't got lots of bad news as such. I don't think it shouldn't be difficult for the Lib Dems to hold the majority of the seats
Yeah.
won in 2024. So I don't think there's bad news there, really. And in some ways, I mean, potentially some of the Conservative voters, if they might stay with the Lib Dems as a way of holding Labour more to account next time round. It's really hard to say, but as I keep saying, there's just so many moving parts, and every strategy depends so much on every other party's strategy. But I do think, and this is I think a good news story for the Lib Dems is what will probably matter for those Conservative voters is local delivery, actually, for keeping them in the Lib Dem column, which is what the Lib Dems are known for when taking seats. So again, I don't think it's necessarily bad news. I think the difficulty is the expansion beyond, if it's taking that ambition beyond where it is. I don't think holding the position is necessarily a problem, although the strategic choices, like I say, the Conservatives after the Senedd and Scottish Parliament elections are languishing in the polls well behind reform, and decide that actually their better strategy is to replace their leader and tack to the centre, then I think that starts to give a few more strategic issues.
Yeah, I mean, it is really striking to me how little interest there seems to be in the Conservatives in winning back seats from the Lib Dems. And particularly, it puzzled me through their leadership election, because I would have thought there's obviously some flaw in what I'm about to say, but I can't really see what the flaw is now. I was expecting that things like the Tory party membership in Surrey and in Oxfordshire, where they'd just seen a whole host of Tory MPs ousted by the Lib Dems, that would have been on their minds in the leadership election. Was, yes, you're talking all this stuff about Nigel Farage and reform, but what about beating the Lib Dems in my seat, where we had a Tory MP since before the invention of writing, and now we've got this horrible Lib Dem. Why are you not talking about how we're going to win it? But there doesn't seem to be very much interest at all amongst Conservatives in wanting to defeat the Lib Dems. But as you say, there may be some further electoral or political shock that changes that, and obviously we can't predict that. But if you were, really pushed, let's say you find yourself trapped in a lift that's broken down with Ed Davey, and he's saying to you, Paula, yeah, okay, but what should I do? What are the voters that you think are most amenable to the Lib Dems to try to reach next? You've said that they might be hard to reach, but who are the least hard?
The least hard to reach. Well, the Lib Dem vote share is more concentrated in more moderate. It's concentrated in the most liberal groups, but outside of the liberal left, they're smaller. And there's a lot of competition on that liberal left vote. The Greens are competing there, the Independents are largely competing there, Labour historically at least has been competing there. So that's quite a competitive segment. There's also, I think, some space in the more moderate groups. I hesitate to use the word centrist, but in that kind of centre of the political space, I think there's some space there as well for those that are totally turned off by the Conservatives chasing reform, heavily anti-reform, and as the Conservatives chase them, that just makes them more and more anti-conservative, but who are starting to go, hang on a minute, not sure we like Labour all that much either. So I guess that's the kind of sort of traditional space in some ways.
And one of the challenges in doing that is to appeal to the non-liberal left in that potential sort of bigger Lib Dem coalition in a way that doesn't put off the liberal left, and vice versa, and that there are some issues which are unifying across those different groups, and some issues which are very divisive. And which in a way was the Lib Dem approach to the 2024 election of focusing in on issues like the NHS and sewage that span multiple different segments of the electorate. And in that sense, it was not a sort of niche targeting different slices of the electorate, but it was finding issues that worked across multiple different slices.
Yeah.
So we fixed the Lib Dems. I therefore have only one more question for you, Paula, because I saw on Blue Sky recently that you've been looking up some polling from 2014 on, and I kid you not, listeners, this is absolutely true, the views of UKIP voters on ghosts. So why, Paula, and what did you learn?
So I think I should clarify that I wasn't specifically interested in whether UKIP voters believed in ghosts or vampires, which was on the same poll. I teach a final year unit on public opinion, public opinion and democracy, and I like to use some fun polling at the start as a way into a what is a public opinion question. And I hadn't taught the unit for a few years. And the data that I previously used, which actually your listeners might find amusing, looked at the Star Wars characters voters from different parties would most like to be, with Lib Dem voters. This is data from 2015, most likely to want to be Chewbacca or R2-D2.
There's some joke about liberals and beards and Chewbacca to be made there.
I have been endlessly fascinated about why the Lib Dems didn't want to be the human characters, but
it's cutting, Paula. Cutting.
It gets worse. Yeah. We've got UKIP voters were the group that were most likely to want to be Darth Vader, so you can do your own jokes there.
Suddenly, I'm all for this analysis. You're spot on, Paula. Spot on.
Conservatives, particularly apparently like well-connected women, because they wanted to be Princess Leia. And for Labour, it was Han Solo. So there were some threads in there that I could use at the start of a lecture. But I thought 2015 was a little bit out of date. So I went looking back to try and find something equally fun, but with more recent voting. And I'm afraid if somebody wants to poll the Star Wars for me before next year, I'd be very happy to have the crosstabs. Yeah. But instead, I ended up with whether King Kong or Godzilla would win in a fight. Most people think Godzilla, and there's no political differences. How faithfuls versus traitors would vote, which more in common had run the day before. But sadly, that didn't reveal a great deal of difference either. And for those that are really still interested in UKIP and ghosts, 41% of UKIP voters in 2014 believed in ghosts, 31% of Lib Dems, and all the usual reading from Crossbreaks caveats apply.
You remind me of a poll, it must be from quite a few years ago now, because it was about UKIP as well, rather than Reform or the Brexit Party. It was a YouGov poll asking people whether they believed the world would end in nuclear Armageddon. And UKIP voters were more likely to believe that. And I always thought it's quite a nice example of, I think it's clearly, not a poll finding of major significance. But I feel like it does tell you something about the underlying different psychological makeups of supporters of different parties. If you've got supporters of a party who are much more likely to basically believe we're all doomed and going to be incinerated in a horrific, nuclear holocaust than, other parties, it feels like there is something about your broader outlook, your levels of optimism, the extent to which you're harking back to the past or have got great hopes for the future, etc. That fun questions like that do sometimes sum up. And it's why I've always a fan of those silly focus group questions like which animal is a party leader, because I think in the focus groups, I can't remember which company's focus groups it was that used to ask the animal question of Keir Starmer, but always got the answer, or not always, often got the answer that people thought he was an eagle, which feels to me there's something quite subtly revealing about that, because eagles are not warm and cuddly. You don't have people sharing photos of cute eagles on their social media in the way that you would have with lots of other animals. But there is also something admirable and impressive. And I just think there's quite a nuanced answer there that people give by picking eagle. And there's quite an interesting psychological insight as well with nuclear holocaust or not. Not quite so sure on ghosts, but you're the expert, you're teaching the course. So I clearly need to think more about the value that we can get from asking people about their views on poltergeists.
I did also find this really lovely thing that I used for teaching, which showed that 16% thought that they could probably win the 1% club. you know, the quiz.
Yeah.
But actually, it allows you to go into some real depth about polling because it only asks people who've watched the 1% Club. So obviously, the people who watch quiz shows are
Oh.
not going to be a representative
Mm.
cross section. So you might expect more than
Yeah.
1% of them to be able to win it. So that was my
Excellent.
other fun polling, but I don't have that by party. I can't tell you how many Lib Dems
Oh, if
think
only.
that.
If only which party supporters are most prone to irrational overconfidence. I'm just going to
I'm
guess, given that
absolutely
this
sure I
often,
can tell you that based on a gender breakdown.
I was going to say a gender breakdown. I can probably guess because it is sadly predictable when one looks at the polls on that. But on that note, Paula, thank you so much. Really fascinating discussion. Please, listeners, look out in the show notes for follow-ups to our discussion, including links to the article that Paula wrote that I mentioned at the beginning and to the graph that Paula is hopefully imminently about to send me. And you can also find in there links to Paula on Blue Sky and her excellent email newsletter that you can sign up to on Substack. And I should just say that to my Lib Dem listeners, the top post on her Substack page at the moment is all about the Lib Dems. So definitely go click that link in the show notes. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening.